sorted out a couple technical items, and we're ready to go. I'm Larry Edwards. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences, and it's my pleasure to introduce Stephanie Olson, who is a professor at Purdue. And those of you who have been around for a while may remember Stephanie fondly from her time here. She's an alumna of our department, graduated in 2011. And even in, as an undergraduate, she garnered multiple number of our undergraduate awards. And I guess I can say this, she's one of our all-time top students in geochemical principles. I still remember back then. Among the awards that she got here was the Outstanding TA Award, and then quite a few others. So Stephanie went on to do a master's at Penn State, and then on to UC Irvine to do her PhD. And then she followed that with a named postdoctoral fellowship at University of Chicago, and then on to Purdue from there. So Stephanie has interests in surface conditions. So in part, surface conditions on Earth associated with the evolution of life, and also interested in surface conditions on other planets associated with the possibility of life on these planets. So Stephanie's going to be talking about this topic. If you read her abstract, you will know that. But if you haven't read her abstract, you're going to hear all about it now. So she's going to be talking about signatures of photosynthesis beyond the solar system. So Stephanie, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for that kind introduction and for the opportunity to speak today. Yeah, as Larry mentioned, my research really focuses on the coevolution of life and environment. So both how the environment constrains life, but then also how life goes on to totally transform its environment as well. And so this talk will focus on photosynthesis specifically, and how that metabolism has impacted our planet, how things might play out a little bit differently on other worlds, and then ultimately how we might recognize photosynthesis beyond our solar system. But before I get to the aliens, I'd like to start by just acknowledging that I am speaking to you from my house because my beautiful St. Bernard Olivine is recovering from an unplanned surgery. And so I think I've done everything in my power to make sure that she will be comfortable and quiet for the next hour. But if she is disruptive, here is the face to associate with the disturbance. And please forgive her, she's really cute. I would also like to share a quick kind of geochemical anecdote relating to my dog. And that is the last time she had the misfortune of wearing a cone, Olivine actually turned green. And it turns out that now all you need is a degree from the University of Minnesota and an interest in Earth history to understand why. So if you've ever met a St. Bernard or seen the movie Beethoven, you know that St. Bernards are a particularly drooly breed. And so despite my best efforts, there was quite a moist environment developing within the folds of her neck. You can also see that there's a little bit of red staining developing within the cone. And that's because dog saliva actually has iron porphyrins in it. And so upon exposure to the oxygen in the atmosphere, ferric oxides form, giving rise to this rusty red color. And because Olive was really sad and slept in this awkward position, and in part because the cone limited oxygen diffusion, she was able to foster an anaerobic environment within her neck swamp. And so what we're seeing here with the green is actually a beautiful redox gradient ranging from rusty red near her lips that saw the oxygen in my living room to this anaerobic environment in which green rust formed instead. And so if you've never seen green rust, that's because, well, it's not very common on present day Earth because we have lots of oxygen around. But back in the Archean, prior to the oxygenation of our atmosphere as a consequence of photosynthesis, green rust could have been relatively common, perhaps to the extent that the Archean Ocean may have appeared green. So again, if Olive makes a ruckus, my apologies, but she's a very, very good dog. Okay, now on to the aliens. All right, so here I'm showing a history of the cumulative known exoplanet detections here on the y-axis through time on the x-axis, beginning with 1989 and continuing through 2001. So this figure is a little bit out of date. By now, we already know of more than 5,000 exoplanets or planets beyond our solar system. And then of course, along the top here, I've highlighted some of the notable landmarks in my own life. So there are a couple of things to note here. First is that the field of exoplanets is extremely young. And so every single exoplanet we know of has been detected within my lifetime. And actually, the overwhelming majority of them have occurred within my academic lifetime as well. And so it was 2007 when I entered the University of Minnesota as a physics major. But then upon taking Mark Hirschman's intro geology class, I switched to become a geology major. And so this is a field that has transformed quite literally in real time, only since going to grad school, essentially. And I did not go to grad school to study exoplanets. All right, so we know of lots of worlds beyond our solar system, but unfortunately, we actually know very little about each of these planets. And that's because when we detect exoplanets, for the most part, we're detecting their influence on their host stars rather than actually observing these worlds. But this will change in the coming decades as we build bigger and better telescopes. Nonetheless, of the thousands of known exoplanets, a couple dozen of them actually reside within their star's habitable zone. So the definition of the habitable zone that you may have heard journalists use is that it's the region around a star where a planet could have surface liquid water. Interior to that, it's too hot. Exterior to that, it's too cold. But within the habitable zone, also sometimes referred to as the Goldilocks zones, temperatures could be just right to support surface liquid water. A slightly more correct definition of the habitable zone is that it is the region around a star where an Earth-sized rocky planet with the right atmosphere and Earth-like climate feedbacks, specifically the silicate weathering thermostat, could have surface liquid water over geologic timescales. But the thing to know about the habitable zone is that it is defined by stellar properties, specifically stellar temperature, not planetary properties. And so being in the habitable zone actually says nothing about an exoplanet, because the habitable zone definition explicitly assumes Earth. And so a planet in the habitable zone does not necessarily have surface liquid water, and a planet in the habitable zone with surface liquid water is not necessarily a good place to live, because life has additional requirements beyond just access to liquid water. And so ultimately, just being in the habitable zone says that if Earth works the way we think Earth works, if we put it on that planet's orbit, Earth might be habitable, but doesn't actually say much about an individual planet. And so in the coming decades, these habitable zone planets will be priorities for observation. But unfortunately, we will not be visiting these worlds. The closest exoplanet to us is about 4.2 light years away. So these are really, really distant. And so we can't even take pretty pictures of these worlds. And so in press releases, you might see beautiful depictions of habitable zone exoplanets. But in reality, what we see when we view exoplanets is just a couple pixels of light. And from that light, we have to extract lots of information regarding habitability and even biosignatures. So as an example, this is Earth's spectrum. So on the x-axis, we have various wavelengths of light, from the optical through the visible infrared to the near infrared. And then brightness on the y-axis, or the amount of photons at each wavelength. And there is a lot of information embedded within this spectrum. So over here on the left, this increase in brightness at blue wavelengths is due to Rayleigh scattering. This is what makes our atmosphere appear blue to us. And if we were to see a similar slope on an exoplanet, we could infer that that planet also has a dense atmosphere, the kind of atmosphere that might help stabilize surface liquid water. Because whereas the habitable zone kind of accounts for temperatures that might be conducive to surface liquid water, you also need a sufficient atmosphere to stabilize surface liquid water. Within this spectrum, we also see absorption features associated with carbon dioxide. It has very nice absorption features because, of course, it's a greenhouse gas. And these are features that we would also expect to find on habitable planets if they have a functional silicate weathering feedback to stabilize climate over long timescales. And then, of course, we can see some absorption features associated with water vapor as well. Now, we have to be careful, though, not to jump from water vapor to surface liquid water, because an exoplanet might be really hot, and so all of the water exists as vapor rather than being on the surface. But this is nonetheless something we would expect to find on a habitable world. To help convince ourselves that the water vapor is not just in the atmosphere, but there is actually surface liquid water, we can actually stare at a planet for a while as it is rotating, and we can see continents pass into and out of view. And this will be reflected in time variable brightness of the planet. And so while we can't construct detailed maps of land mass on a planet, we can construct kind of simple maps like this, where colors here reflect land fraction. White means lots of land, whereas darker blues reflect lots of ocean. And so this is extremely powerful because this is not only a way to recognize the presence of surface liquid water instead of just water vapor, but this can also help us recognize continents, which you might be interested in if you think that Earth-like plate tectonics are a really important mechanism for recycling material through a planetary system and sustaining life over geologic timescales. Okay, and then of course, within this spectrum, we also see features that are the consequence of life. So most famously, Earth's atmosphere has lots of oxygen, which is the product of photosynthesis, and it has several absorption features shown here. Earth also has some methane that is overwhelmingly biological in origin, although that might not be the case elsewhere. And then here we can even see the fingerprints of chlorophyll, which is a photosynthetic pigment that actually directly interacts with light, and so can leave its fingerprints on the spectrum as well. Now, unfortunately, not all life is well positioned to affect planetary spectra. And so what that means is that not all life will be easily detectable from distances of many light years. So as an example of that, some people think that the earliest life here on Earth was chemosynthetic life that lived in association with hydrothermal vents at the seafloor. And this kind of life might be common, in the solar system or universe, but it's ultimately going to be really hard to detect because these communities tend to be localized around sources of geochemical energy. They tend to be isolated from the atmosphere. In this case, the hydrothermal vent is isolated from the atmosphere by a couple kilometers of seawater. But somewhere like Europa, that might be 100 kilometers of seawater plus another 30 kilometers of an ice shell. And so detecting life in that scenario is likely impossible. But then more fundamentally, chemosynthetic life is simply exploiting chemical energy in the form of disequilibrium in its environment. And so in doing so, it's kind of performing the exact same chemistry that would happen in the absence of life. It's just making a living by doing it faster than would occur in the absence of biological enzymes. And so it's not really producing any signals that we might recognize as weird or the product of life. Photosynthesis, on the other hand, is well positioned to influence planetary spectra. And so it's my opinion that remotely detectable exoplanet life probably is photosynthetic. And that's because photosynthesis has the potential to be global in scale. It is by definition happening near the surface and thus better capable of influencing planetary spectra. And unlike chemosynthesis, photosynthetic metabolisms translate stellar energy into chemical energy in the form of disequilibrium between reduced organic carbon, and in the case of oxygenic photosynthesis, the oxygen that's produced. And so this results in chemical signals that we can point to and recognize as weird or difficult to explain without life. All right, so the most famous consequence of photosynthesis here on Earth is the oxygenation of our atmosphere. So here I'm plotting atmospheric oxygen through time, with time advancing from left to right. And so on the earliest Earth, there was effectively no oxygen in our atmosphere, which is actually a really good thing because everything we think we know about prebiotic chemistry is just wildly incompatible with the presence of oxygen. And then oxygen subsequently rose in at least two major steps. I like to point out that this is a log scale. And so this first oxygenation event, known as the Great Oxidation Event, or the GOE, is actually the much smaller of the two oxygenation events in terms of moles of oxygen. Now, the version of the story that you may have heard in an intro level geology class is that cyanobacteria appeared, began making oxygen, and oxygen very soon began to accumulate in the atmosphere. But it's actually much more complicated than that. The GOE was apparently delayed from the origin of oxygenic photosynthesis, maybe by as much as 500 million years or more. And so we have this extended interval of time during which we think life was making oxygen, but for whatever reason was not very good at oxygenating its environment. The other thing to note about this history is that there is really considerable uncertainty regarding where oxygen levels stabilized following the GOE and what the Proterozoic surface environment was like. We don't know, we think oxygen remained relatively low, but we don't know why it stayed so low. And then we don't know why it ultimately rose during the beginning, again, in the Neo-Proterozoic. And so for that reason, we don't actually know if high levels of atmospheric oxygen like we have today were an inevitable or even likely consequence of oxygenic photosynthesis here on Earth. And this is potentially problematic for exoplanet life because now I have overlain an estimate of the kind of oxygen levels that we could hope to see with our own telescopes. And the take home here is that it's not obvious that we could see ourselves or infer the presence of oxygenic photosynthesis here on Earth for 2 billion years following the GOE and several billion years following the origin of life somewhere back here. And so although oxygen is a great biosignature, it's important to keep in mind that it probably only works for about 10% of Earth's history. The good news is that the gaseous biosignatures arising from photosynthesis are actually quite diverse and include things that aren't oxygen and aren't even involved directly in photosynthesis. And that's because I've already mentioned that the outcome of photosynthesis is to translate stellar energy into chemical energy. And then that chemical energy goes on to fuel Earth's entire biosphere. And so the energy that we get from our food ultimately tracks back to photosynthesis. And so more photosynthesis means more of just about every metabolism and more production of waste products associated with those metabolisms. So for example, more photosynthesis can lead to more things like methanogenesis. It can lead to more sulfate reduction and production of things like hydrogen sulfide or denitrification, which can yield nitrous oxide, which is also a gas that has relatively few geological sources. And so whatever your favorite biosignature is, having more photosynthesis probably means more of that biosignature. And I've hinted at this already too, but the signatures of photosynthesis aren't limited to just gases. And that's because photosynthesis is a unique metabolism in that it's actually actively interacting with light, which is the one and only thing we can observe. And so in some circumstances, we may be able to see the fingerprints of chlorophyll in light that is reflected from a planet to our telescope. The one catch here is that this is a biosignature that probably requires life on land for that to work. The final biosignature arising from photosynthesis that I'll discuss is seasonality, which is kind of like the pulse of a biosphere. So here I'm showing atmospheric CO2 through time as measured at Mauna Loa Observatory. And of course, the long-term average increase in CO2 is the consequence of burning fossil fuels. But then superimposed on that is a systematic oscillation that is the consequence of seasonal shifts in the balance of photosynthesis, which is drawing down CO2 and incorporating it into biomass, and respiration, which is releasing CO2 back into the environment. And so if we saw a signal like this elsewhere, we may be able to infer the presence of life, even though CO2 itself is not a biological product, or at least not a, I should say, uniquely biological product. And this is potentially really powerful because, we expect to see CO2 on habitable worlds. And so if life elsewhere is carbon-based, I think it's reasonable to expect that seasonally variable biological carbon exchange with its environment can be expressed in atmospheric chemistry, kind of regardless of the details of biochemistry on those worlds. Unfortunately, though, CO2 is extremely soluble in seawater. So here in red, I'm showing the same CO2 measurements from Mauna Loa, just detrended to remove the anthropogenic signal. And then overlain with that are similar observations from the South Pole Observatory. And the point here is that the signal in the Southern Hemisphere, which has a much larger ocean fraction compared to the Northern Hemisphere, is significantly muted. And so almost all of the seasonal signal that we see in the Northern Hemisphere is the consequence of photosynthesis occurring on land, which is a relatively recent development in Earth's history. And so a lot of people are concerned about false positives or signals that might trick us into thinking we have found life when in reality we haven't. The scenario that I am more concerned about is the issue of false negatives, or this unfortunate scenario in which we might actually find a planet that has life on it, but then fail to recognize it because life simply hasn't influenced planetary spectra in a way that's remotely detectable. And so I've talked about how atmospheric oxygen works for less than 10% of Earth's history. And the chlorophyll absorption signals and seasonality might require land-based life specifically. And plants have been around for even less time than our oxygenated atmosphere. And so the point here is that having photosynthesis, even though it's this uniquely detectable metabolism, is not enough. We need to be concerned about, not just the possibility of having photosynthesis, but also the environmental conditions that allow photosynthesis to really thrive and optimize its impact on environment. And so while a lot of people will discuss habitability as a binary, a world can either support life or it can't, I prefer to think of a habitability spectrum that exists among worlds that can support life. So these worlds range from those that are perhaps survivable if life were introduced at the right time, to those that are truly excellent hosts for life and may support much larger, more detectable photosynthetic biospheres. Now, in talking about looking for an Earth twin or Earth 2.0, we kind of implicitly place Earth as an end member on this spectrum, as the best case scenario end member, in fact. And there's actually no evidence to suggest that that is true. So yes, Earth is very well suited for our specific needs, but we are the consequence of nearly 4 billion years of evolution by natural selection on this planet. And so that's actually an entirely unremarkable observation that Earth is so good for us. And photosynthetic life is ultimately more detectable than humans. And so we should be concerned, not with looking for the planets that we could personally live on, but those that are most likely to support large photosynthetic biospheres. And so that is what the remainder of this talk will focus on. Where is photosynthesis likely to be most successful? So at the global scale, the success of photosynthesis depends on only a few basic ingredients. We have water, photons, carbon here on Earth, that's in the form of CO2. Elsewhere, maybe photosynthesis uses a different carbon species like methane, and nutrients. So here on Earth, that's primarily nitrogen and phosphate. Elsewhere, that need not be true. But the basic point is that life elsewhere is going to be made out of something, and it will need access to those chemical building blocks. Now, theoretically, any of these 4 ingredients can limit life, at least locally or seasonally. But here on Earth, the thing that really dictates the success of photosynthesis is nutrient availability. More nutrients means more photosynthesis, which means more biosignatures. Again, not just of the direct products of photosynthesis like oxygen, but more of every metabolism and their associated biological waste products. The problem is that unlike water, photons, and carbon, which we can hope to see with a telescope, nutrients can't be directly observed. And so one of my goals over the past couple of years has been to try to understand how remotely observable features of a planet can actually affect nutrient cycles, the success of photosynthesis, and thus biospheric detectability. And so now I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about the phosphorus cycle on Earth and how that might differ on planets that are not Earth. All right, so here is a kind of typical profile of phosphate availability in the ocean. Phosphate levels in the surface mixed layer are very, very low because that's where photosynthesis is actively occurring and consuming all that phosphate. But in the deep, dark depths of the ocean, decomposition of sinking cells actually releases that phosphate back into the water column. This is a phenomenon referred to as the biological pump. And so in order to sustain high rates of photosynthesis, we need a mechanism by which we can make steep water back to the surface and make that phosphate re-available for photosynthesis again. The problem is that our ocean is heated from above, and so vertical mixing is really quite limited because our ocean is, on global average, stably stratified with respect to density. The exception being at high latitudes where surface waters can get really cold. And so upwelling of nutrient-rich water from the ocean interior to the surface where photosynthesis occurs only in very specific regions of the ocean. So for example, upwelling can occur along coastlines where the winds are pushing water offshore, requiring that water rise up from below to replace it. A similar phenomenon occurs along the equator where opposing directions of Coriolis deflection on either side also results in divergence of surface waters, allowing water to rise up from below. And so if we look at the distribution of photosynthesis in our ocean, we see that it is concentrated in these regions of upwelling. So this map is showing chlorophyll concentrations in green, and you can see that the most chlorophyll and photosynthesis is occurring in coastal upwelling regions, a little bit at the equator, and then also at high latitudes where that density stratification is weakest. And so what I have done is use 3D climate models and biogeochemical models to basically take Earth, but make it a little different. So change surface pressure or ocean salinity or rotation rate, obliquity, eccentricity, and see how ocean circulation and nutrient cycles respond, and think about what the consequences for photosynthesis and biosignature production are. And so in the interest of time, I'll unfortunately only be able to talk about obliquity and eccentricity today. Now, obliquity is the tilt of a planet on its axis of rotation. And obliquity gives us our hemispheric seasons. So over here on the left side of this figure, the northern hemisphere is tilted towards the sun and experiencing its summer. But at the opposite point in the orbit, the northern hemisphere is now pointed away from the sun and experiencing its winter. And of course, the southern hemisphere is experiencing the opposite season. And so this is one of the major impacts of changing obliquity, is to increase the magnitude of the seasonal cycle. You can imagine that if you tilted Earth not just 23-ish degrees, but 90 degrees so that it's on its side, you now have a scenario where sometimes the northern hemisphere is pointed directly towards the sun, and other times where it is pointed completely away from the sun and receives no light at all. So in addition to seasons, obliquity is important because it shapes the distribution of stellar energy between the equator and the poles. So here in blue, we have a 0 degree obliquity planet. You can see that the poles, here South Pole on the left, North Pole on the right, never receive any stellar energy, and the equator receives quite a lot of stellar energy. For a more Earth-like obliquity, now the summer pole is starting to receive some stellar energy. They're still cold compared to the equator because they receive much less energy, but they're much warmer than they would be if Earth was not tilted on its axis. But if we move to much higher obliquities, a very interesting thing starts to happen, and the poles actually receive more stellar energy averaged across the year than the equator. And so suddenly the summer pole is the warmest point on the planet, and the equator is relatively cool. And so on these worlds, we may have the development of ice belts around the equator rather than ice caps like we have here on Earth. And so high obliquity worlds will have really different spatial patterns of photosynthesis as a result. So here I am showing surface temperature represented by colors as a function of latitude along the x-axis. So these are zonal averages from South Pole at the bottom to North Pole at the top through time. So on the left here, we have a 0 degree obliquity planet. So it has a warm equator, cold poles, and because it has 0 obliquity, no seasons, no temporal variability. All the way on the other side of this figure, we have the 90 degree obliquity end member. And so you can see here now that the summer pole is the hottest point on the globe, whereas the equator is relatively cool. And we have really large seasonal variability in surface temperature here from like, I don't know, negative 20 degrees Celsius to more than 50 degrees Celsius at high latitudes. And so you can imagine that if you're a photosynthetic plant, that is, the high latitude continents are perhaps a very stressful place to live on this world. Nonetheless, the ocean, oh gosh, is actually a pretty good place to live. Sorry, these figures are extremely large, and so changing the slide takes a little bit of time. Okay, so on high obliquity planets, the ocean maintains habitable sea surface temperatures at all latitudes at all times. And in fact, if you compare the 0-degree obliquity world to the 90-degree obliquity world, the temporal variability, despite having a really extreme seasonality in atmospheric temperature, the seasonality in sea surface temperature is actually very muted compared to the spatial variability in sea surface temperature on a more Earth-like world. And so the area of habitable marine habitat is potentially larger on these worlds. One potential concern, though, is that the overturning circulation and regions of upwelling are really poorly developed on these worlds. And that's because the surface winds are actually changing directions seasonally, and the poles are oscillating between being the hottest place on the globe to the coldest place on the world. And so we have no region of persistent deep water formation or persistent upwelling either. And so that's potentially a concern for photosynthetic life. Nonetheless, though, I was surprised to find that productivity actually increases with obliquity from 0 degrees all the way up to 90 degrees here on the x-axis. And the difference is pretty significant. It's about a factor of 3. And this is despite the fact that the total amount of nutrients and carbon in the ocean are identical between these scenarios. And even the amount of light is unchanged. Obliquity just shapes the spatial distribution, not the total amount. And so this increased productivity, despite otherwise equivalent ingredients for photosynthesis, implies more efficient use of available resources and enhanced recycling mechanisms of some form, despite the fact that the circulation is actually much weaker. So what's going on here is that we're actually seeing really dramatic seasonality of the mixed layer depth. So here on the bottom, I'm showing mixed layer depth, and on the top is the sea surface temperatures that I've already shown you. And mixed layer depth is basically a metric for the degree of thermal stratification. And so on the low obliquity scenario, you have warm equator, warm sea surface temperature, strong stratification, very shallow mixed layer. Whereas you have cold poles, weak thermal stratification, and a much deeper wind mixed layer. And the extent to which the mixed layer depth varies seasonally, of course, increases with obliquity to the point where at high latitudes on high obliquity planets, despite the fact that the sea surface temperature variation does not appear that dramatic, the resulting consequences for the mixed layer are actually a couple of orders of magnitude. And this has a huge impact on nutrients. So I've already shown you this phosphate cartoon. We have very low phosphate concentrations in surface seawater due to photosynthesis. But then if you abruptly increase the mixed layer depth by cooling surface seawater, this is actually a mechanism by which you can stir back in nutrients from the ocean interior directly into the mixed layer, so that they can stimulate more photosynthesis. So here now, I'm showing mixed layer data that I've already shown you with the spatial patterns of export productivity now on the bottom. And you can see here, let's just look at the highest obliquity scenario. In the winter, photosynthesis totally shuts down because the hemisphere is directed directly away from the star. It's receiving no light, therefore no photosynthesis. The mixed layer is getting colder and colder and thus deeper and deeper. But then as the sun comes back in the spring, we have these really dramatic blooms that develop first at low latitudes, but the blooms persist actually for several months moving to higher and higher latitudes as the sun returns. And again, that's because the deep winter mixed layer has stirred back nutrients. And so we have lots of nutrients just waiting for light to support very high rates of photosynthesis. And so even though photosynthesis is occurring over a smaller area of the planet and for less time than on our lower obliquity planets, this is able to drive much higher rates of photosynthesis simply by replenishing nutrients in this way. Okay, now let's talk very quickly about the consequences of eccentricity. So eccentricity also generates seasonality, but in a slightly different way. So eccentricity is the deviation from a circular orbit. And so in other words, the planet is literally moving closer to and further away from its star at various points in its orbit. And so this world will experience global seasons as a consequence of its eccentric orbit. Another qualitative difference is that whereas obliquity-driven seasons are symmetric in duration, eccentricity-driven seasons are not. And that's because the planet moves much quicker when it is closer to its host star than when it is further from its host star. So gravitational attraction between planet and star varies with 1 over the separation squared. And so it speeds up quite dramatically at close approach and then slows down quite dramatically as it's further away. So we have relatively brief summers and very long winters on planets that have eccentric orbits. So here I'm showing the obliquity data across the top that I've already shown you. And now increasing down this first column, we have scenarios ranging from 0 eccentricity to 0.4 eccentricity. This is actually 0.4 does not sound big, but this is really big. Any higher than that, and you have to start worrying about planet-planet collisions and ejection from the stellar system. So this is quite extreme, but nonetheless, we see photosynthesis is occurring at all latitudes across the entire year, which is in stark contrast with the obliquity-driven seasonality scenario. And so if we now look at the combined effects of what happens if you have high obliquity plus high eccentricity, you can see that the effect of obliquity is to basically generate these winters during which photosynthesis shuts down entirely. And then the effect of increasing eccentricity is to make the distributions of photosynthesis increasingly asymmetric. So in this highest obliquity and highest eccentricity scenario down here in the lower right corner, you can see that the northern hemisphere winter is coinciding with the eccentricity driven global summer, such that the winter is relatively brief and there is a long period of illumination and photosynthesis occurring in the northern hemisphere. And then the opposite is true in the southern hemisphere. The southern hemisphere is pointed away from the star and experiencing its winter along with the eccentricity driven winter, resulting in many months during which photosynthesis is simply not viable. Despite that, though, we found that primary productivity is increasing with both obliquity, as I have shown you already on the left, and eccentricity as well on the right. And perhaps most surprising is that even the combination of extreme obliquity, so 90-degree obliquity and 0.4 eccentricity, results in a biosphere that is significantly more productive than Earth. And so we've argued that high obliquity and high eccentricity worlds could be super habitable worlds that support very large, more detectable marine biospheres than our own planet. A final benefit of these worlds is that this mechanism by which we're replenishing nutrients to the mixed layer to stimulate more photosynthesis also helps get biosignature gases out of the ocean interior and into the atmosphere, where they can affect remotely observable properties of the planet. So as an example here on top, this is Green Lake in New York. And Green Lake has a ton of hydrogen sulfide that is biogenic in origin at depth. But Green Lake is not leaking sulfide to the atmosphere. And in fact, this is a state park. There are lots of people happily swimming in this lake, blissfully unaware of the toxic sulfide beneath the surface. And that's because this is a stably stratified system in which there is very limited mixing of sulfidic water from depth to the surface. The Salton Sea in California is a less well-behaved system. The Salton Sea has a tendency to become oxygen poor and sometimes sulfidic throughout the summer. And then as density stratification weakens into the fall, occasionally the winds will stir up low oxygen, maybe sulfidic water from depth, killing lots of fish and sometimes allowing sulfide to enter the atmosphere. And even 150 miles away, you can smell that sulfide. And so this seasonality is good, not just for increasing productivity, but also getting biosignatures out of the water column and into the atmosphere. And then the final appeal is that, I've already mentioned that seasonality and atmospheric composition could be a biosignature. Well, this is one mechanism to really amplify that signal and increase the detectability of life further. So I have covered a lot of ground, and we'll really quickly summarize so that we have some time for questions. But hopefully I've convinced you that exoplanet life detection is hard, and photosynthesis is perhaps the most detectable of the potential exometabolisms. And so we should be looking for the types of worlds where we think photosynthetic life will be most successful and thus most detectable. And it's my opinion that perhaps our best candidates are worlds that have exaggerated seasonal cycles, either due to obliquity and or eccentricity, which enhances nutrient recycling, biospheric productivity, and biosignature export to the atmosphere. And I'd like to emphasize that this mechanism is probably not unique to Earth, because what I have described is ultimately simple physics, not complicated biochemistry that might be unique to Earth life. So I will stop talking now and accept any questions.
Thanks, Stephanie. That was a really stimulating talk. I think just one comment. It's really interesting how when you're looking at all sort of possible worlds out there, that you have the wherewithal to kind of look at all sorts of different conditions. I mean, those of us that are working in the Quaternary, we're looking at a couple degrees shift in obliquity either way, and you can kind of look at the whole range of possibilities. So that's really exciting. Let's see. I think we can take some questions, and just a couple. So I will be monitoring the chat, and Stephanie probably can also monitor the chat for questions. And if people raise their hand, those of you that are online, if you raise your hand, then Stephanie or I can recognize you. And then I guess maybe John would be the person to monitor questions in B20. And so I think between the three of us, we can identify people. And then, the one important ground rule is that, I don't know if we were doing this when you were a student, Stephanie, but we take questions from students first, either, undergraduate or graduate students first. So I think I'll open it up to anyone online or in person that's a student who would have a question.
We have one here in the room.
I was wondering if those, like the obliquity graphs and things that you showed, were those all models?
Oh, yes. Yeah, so those are all simulations I did with a biogeochemical model called C-Genie, coupled to an atmospheric GCM called Plasm. So that's a model that accounts for the physics that drive ocean circulation and includes a variety of metabolisms like photosynthesis, aerobic respiration, anaerobic respiration, and various other redox transformations. So this is a model that I've spent something like a decade now. I can't believe I'm that old, modifying from a model that was originally designed for simulation of present day-ish Earth and in particular investigating the consequences of anthropogenic climate change to something that you can use to simulate very different worlds like Archean Earth or now even exoplanets.
Yeah. Do we have any like data from exoplanets that represents anything like that you've modeled?
Yeah, so we've detected now thousands of exoplanets, and we are just now starting to be able to measure the compositions of their atmospheres using the James Webb Space Telescope that just launched about a year ago. Measuring seasonality specifically is not something that James Webb will be able to do, however. So James Webb ultimately launched, I think, 14 years behind schedule and $9 billion over budget. And so it was initially intended to launch in 2007. And back in 2007, I was just starting as an undergraduate, and we knew exoplanets existed, but we didn't know, we hadn't found very many yet. And so James Webb was never intended to be an exoplanet mission. This is kind of a general astrophysics instrument that very clever people have figured out how to use to look at exoplanets now since it was launched. And so we will have this kind of observations in the coming decades with the next generation of space-based telescopes. And in fact, the types of simulations we're doing are actively informing the capabilities that we need in those telescopes. So we're, as an example, because oxygen is potentially so difficult to detect based on Earth's history, we've argued that being able to detect ozone, which has really strong absorption features and is much easier to see at low levels, is perhaps a more important capability, which has some practical implications for, what kind of coatings you put on your mirrors and how big you make your mirrors and all sorts of things that engineers worry about. So short answer is no, we don't have those observations yet, but they are coming, and it's really important that we do this work now in advance of the observations so that we can make sure that our telescopes can see the thing that we think is most likely to reveal the presence of life.
Very cool, thank you.
So Sanath has their hand up online. So Saneth, I see you've unmuted yourself. So please go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Stephanie. I know you purposely left out the modeling related to rotation of the planet, but could you briefly summarize how that plays a role into habitability?
Yeah, so rotation is really exciting, actually. So rotation, Ekman transport, which is the wind-driven portion of ocean circulation, actually has a 1/over rotation rate dependency. And that has to do with basically deflection of the flow by the rotation of the planet. And the magnitude of that deflection scales with rotation rate and is associated with frictional energy loss. So faster rotation, more frictional energy loss, less effective wind-driven ocean circulation. Whereas slow rotation, less frictional energy loss, the winds get much better at pushing water around, including things like driving, divergence in surface flow, and upwelling and nutrient recycling. And so we've argued that slower rotating planets might support larger biospheres for that reason. And I'm particularly excited about this because Earth's rotation rate has actually changed through time. So Archean Earth might have had a day length of only like 12 hours compared to 24 today. And so I've argued that maybe one of the reasons why cyanobacteria were so bad at oxygenating the atmosphere for so long is simply that they had less efficient nutrient recycling and were at a lower productivity biosphere than we have today.
Got
Okay,
another question in the room.
okay, go ahead with that.
Hi, Stephanie. This is Dita. Thanks for a great talk. It was very interesting. I was wondering, my question I was going to ask is kind of bouncing off Sana's question too. Like, how would the orbital period affect photosynthesis or this productivity in your models? You have any sense for that?
Yeah, so orbital period, I guess, would affect seasonal duration. And so I would expect that longer seasons might be more conducive to driving larger magnitude cycles. And so having a relatively long year could be associated with more detectable life. A practical consideration on that front is that longer period planets are further away from their stars, which actually makes them much easier to characterize with direct imaging missions. Because one of the challenges is that if you're trying to look at light reflected from the surface of a planet, the star is right there and it's about 1 billion times brighter. And so separating the two is the primary challenge. And so a further out planet with a longer year is just easier to observe to begin with. And then I think having longer summers and longer winters could contribute to having a larger signal too.
Thank you.
So Taylor Price has their hand up, their virtual hand up is, yeah, and I see you've unmuted, so please go ahead.
Hi, Stephanie. I really enjoyed your talk, and I really enjoyed learning about the exoplanet modeling part of this work. Recently, I've been thinking a lot about early Mars and the seasonality at the mid-latitude regions during the Hesperian and Noachian eras. So I was curious to hear your thoughts about some of these models for the potential for photosynthesis on early Mars when there was a lot of that tilt and seasonality happening on that planet.
Yeah, that's a great question. That is also actually somewhat related to the question that Jeff put in the chat, and so I'm going to try to answer them both at the same time. So high obliquity on early Mars is potentially really helpful for stabilizing surface liquid water on early Mars, because higher obliquity planets tend to be warmer on average because you don't have ice caps that are stable. And so these worlds tend to have lower albedo and thus be warmer. And so that helps perhaps with Mars's faint young sun paradox, which is even more problematic than our own faint young sun paradox. That said, though, having time variable obliquity could be problematic. So Mars does not have a substantive moon, and so it experiences large obliquity variations on relatively short time scales geologically. Whereas the Earth, because we have a large moon, we have relatively stable obliquity. And in all of the simulations I showed extreme obliquity, yes, but those were assuming that those worlds had stable obliquity over geologic timescales. How that translates to a world with chaotically varying obliquity is not clear, but I will speculate wildly if you like. I would expect that, wildly varying obliquity would lead to extremely variable surface conditions, both in space and time, on these worlds. And so that would definitely be stressful. But if life were able to survive that, I think that life may ultimately become more resilient to things like mass extinctions, because it has evolved in this this scenario of dramatic environmental change. Resilience against mass extinctions sounds good, but mass extinctions in Earth history are associated with radiations and biological innovation in their aftermath. And so perhaps that's something that could limit the complexity of life on those worlds, kind of integrated over billion-year timescales. So I don't know. It's a fun question to think about, though.
Great. Are there any more student questions? Mark Hirschman is waiting patiently here to ask a question, but if there are other student questions, we should take those first.
No more students in the room.
Okay. Mark, you're on.
All right. Stephanie, I think it's great, of course, that you have a dog named Olivine. But thank you for that great talk. I've long wanted a dog named Gabbro, but we have cats instead of dogs, and for some reason a cat named Gabbro just doesn't have the same appeal. No. My question is also about Mars, and particularly about your insight that CO2 seasonality could be a biosignature. Isn't there a danger of false positives in that? Mars has CO2 seasonality associated with the growth and decay of the CO2 ice caps, right? So
yes.
Is there a way that you can distinguish the two, or is it just a danger?
Fortunately, yes. So you're totally right that Mars has a really pronounced seasonal cycle in atmospheric CO2, because Mars gets cold enough that CO2 is literally condensing out onto the surface and then sublimating. Fortunately, I don't think we're at risk for mistaking that sort of process on an exoplanet for a biosignature or a false positive. And that's because Mars is so cold that we wouldn't see water vapor. And so if the planet's cold enough that you actually have CO2 condensing and sublimating seasonally, you would not expect that you have stable water vapor in the atmosphere. And so that's what I would look for to help distinguish those two scenarios.
So water vapor and CO2 seasonality together sort of
yeah.
get rid of that false positive.
Yeah, exactly. I will also say that I have a cat named Quartz, which I think I'm biased, but I think that's an excellent cat name.
So no, wait a minute. The cat and the dog, they never touch, right? Because Quartz and Olivine. No, never mind.
Get it? Yeah, we got opposite ends of the Bowen's reaction series.
Hi, I have a question in the room. So thanks, that was a wonderful talk and I learned a lot. And so I'm guessing we're thinking mostly or primarily entirely about rocky exoplanets instead of gas giants. And so that says to me, we're talking about something that's closer in to its host star. And then probably bigger planets, I guess, because those are the ones that are going to be easier to see. And then if we're trying to look at high eccentricity, then we have close-in big planets with high eccentricity, and that sings to me tidal interaction. So there are two things I'm curious about. One is the tidal heating going to be an important factor here in some of these cases? And the other is, as soon as this kind of links to Sanath's question, is as the tidal interactions become larger, you're spinning down your planet, your days get longer. But the extreme end of that is you're locked, and one side is a day side and the other side is a night side. So is there a point where you've spun down too much and the days are too long? Thanks.
That's a fun question. So I've actually done simulations of photosynthetic life on tidally locked exoplanets. And no, I don't think that there is an end member where slow rotation becomes less positive. The ocean circulation on tidally locked planets is actually really well developed, and there's really strong nutrient recycling potential. And so the difference between changing obliquity from 0 to 90 was something like a factor of 3. In the tidally locked scenario, it was more like an order of magnitude. These were really productive biospheres, despite the fact that photosynthesis is restricted to the day side only. So I think the answer to your question is no. And prior to the tidal locking end member, that's mostly a concern for M-star planets. But for like a G-star planet that is on an eccentric orbit but does not become tidally locked, I think the tidal heating could actually be really good at sustaining volcanism over very long timescales and lengthening habitability that way. But I think these are great questions because I think the conclusion is almost always that the scenarios that we think of as extreme based on our Earth existence actually almost all benefit life in my simulations. And so I would caution folks against being too focused on the Earth example when we're thinking about life elsewhere.
Okay, are there, I don't see any hands up or anything new in the chat.
More questions here in the room either.
Are there still questions in the room?
No.
Okay, great. I was, we're getting on in time, and I was just letting it go forward since people are really interested in this. But let's thank Stephanie again. And before that, I think there is pizza. So for people in B20, there's going to be pizza up above on the 4th floor. So unfortunately, we should have ordered you a pizza, Stephanie, but those are the breaks, I guess. But thanks again, Stephanie. That's wonderful.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This has been really fun.
Yeah.
All right, I'll see some of you tomorrow.
Yeah, and if you could just stay on for a second, Stephanie, and we can just finish up.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess you're